Now that we're able to get our application up and running, and we can and it responds to us locally through localhost, as we saw earlier, let's go ahead and let's dive into the request and the response objects that live within our Express application. Now, specifically, we're talking about the HTTP request that comes into our Express application from the server and from across the internet, as well as the HTTP response that we will be sending back to the client, which is usually a browser sitting on somebody's computer and or a mobile phone that's made a request to our application. We're going to begin by focusing solely on the request, and then in the next video we'll go over the response object. Now, before we do this, we're going to make some modifications to our Express application so that when we're running it locally, we don't have to constantly shut down our server and restart our server every time we make a change to one of our files in our project. There's a really cool utility out there that we can get off of NPM called Nodemon, which will automatically restart our web server anytime we make changes to any files in our project. And what I mean is in our previous video, in order to start our application, we would do npm start. And if we go to our package.json, we would see right here that when we call the start command using npm, it is going to go ahead and execute the command node on our ww file, which is our web server. And if we come into any of the other files on our application, we change it, like right here, I made some changes to our file. Let's just put some notes in. Changes made. And when I click save, you can see that my server didn't restart. So had I actually added a new route handler here and then saved the file and then gone to my browser and tried to get to that path, I would have gotten a 404 not found. And that is because my node started up the application before I made that change. All of those files were compiled and ready to go, stored in cache for the web server to respond to responses, and the new code that I added was not contained when all that code was packaged up in that node environment to be executed. So we can solve that so that we don't have to sit here and do a Control-C and then restart the server every time we make changes. And we're going to use a cool utility that was created and put out there by the Node community. And the utility we're going to use is called Nodemon. So I'm going to go ahead and clear my terminal here. And we're going to use npm to install Nodemon. And Nodemon, what it does is it executes the node request, or that request for node to launch our application. And it puts a wrapper around the whole thing. And in addition to starting up the server, it actually watches our current application's root folder and looks for any changes made to any of the files in our project. And when there are changes that happen, Nodemon will actually terminate the node process and then restart the server with all of the new code that we just wrote. This makes it so that we don't have to sit and stop and start our server. It also makes it so that if we make changes and we forget to stop and restart our server, we're not spending time or wasting time trying to debug something that's really not a bug. It just happens to be that we didn't restart our server, and our code is perfect. It's just not running in the current node process. So we're going to solve some of these problems by adding Nodemon to our project. And of course, we do that by saying npm install, and then we give the package name of the package we want added to our project, and that is going to be Nodemon, which is short for node monitor. And then we want to add this to our package.json, but we don't want it to show up as a production dependency. In other words, it's not a dependency we need for actually running our application. It's more of a tool that we are using while we're in development. And so we don't want it installed when we deploy to a production environment. We only want it installed when we are working in development. So we can add a little flag to our npm install command by sending --save and then -dev. So this will save this Nodemon instead of in our production dependencies, the dependencies we need for the application to run, and it'll put it inside of a development dependencies section so that it only gets installed when we are in development. So we're going to go ahead and have Nodemon installed. So once it's installed, we go back to our package.json. Let's do a refresh on everything. And in our package.json, we should have a dev dependencies section. Close it, close that. Let's open our JSON back up. And you can see right here we have a dev dependencies. And so Nodemon is now in there as just part of our dev dependencies. Once we know it's installed, then what we're going to do is we are going to go into our scripts right here and the npm start command. And instead of node here, we're going to change this to Nodemon and then save our file, of course. Now that we've made those changes, now when we click start, it's actually going to execute Nodemon locally on our machine. And then every time we make a change to our file, it's just going to go ahead and restart our server. So let's see how that works. I'm going to go ahead and clear my terminal. And now when we do npm start, now you see it runs the node express, it runs the node command, but this time it's Nodemon and it's executing our WW. And here we've got some color-coded awesomeness going on. And it shows us that we are now currently running node.binww, which was the original command we had up here. So you can see that Nodemon acts as a wrapper around that. And now that Nodemon is monitoring our project files, and it's the one that started the node process, it has the ability to stop the process and restart the process for us when files change. So let's go ahead and close our package.json. Let's go ahead and open up our products page, right, our products route right here, where we are sending back, or where we are handling our HTTP requests. And now I'm going to go ahead and change a file. And what we're going to do is I'm going to add a new route to this file. Go ahead and paste it in there. I'm going to tab it back to where it belongs. Now, we already have a get for the root path in products. And I'm going to go ahead and add a, let's say that we're handling an ID path coming in, so :ID. And you'll learn about advanced router paths later on when we get deep into routing. But this just gives us another get, and it would take in an ID. So our path would look something like this based on the fact that we're in the products router. It would be /products/ and then some ID for a product. And then we can kind of stub out some fake data here and send back a JSON object, a dummy JSON object. And let's say that its ID is 123, and then maybe the product name is going to be a basketball. And we're just doing this just for fun. And if you notice, when I clicked save, you could see that this was the original node process being executed. Well, I made those changes and I saved, and then those changes, because Nodemon noticed the changes, it went ahead and restarted the server, and then, well, it stopped the server, and then it restarted the server using that same command again. So if we come over here and we do product/123 and we hit enter, we're going to get back that JSON object that we had in our response to that get. Let's go ahead and do another change so we can actually see it happening again. So I'm going to copy that route there, put it down here, and then this time, I'm going to go ahead and tab it back. And this time, instead of responding to an ID, I'm going to have it respond to maybe a, let's do products/ actually, let's leave it as 123, so an ID, and we're just going to implement a put. And if you remember, put is equivalent to updating an existing object. And we're just going to mock this up. So this is all fake data we're returning because we're not pulling it from a database. And let's just pretend like the update that came in changed it from basketball to football. We'll save that. And if you notice, here we go. Get products 1, 2, 3 was the request that actually came in before. We made some changes and now Node was restarted. We made some more changes, Node was restarted. And now if we come back here and we make the request again, of course, this is just a get. It's not a put, because browsers always do gets unless we're using an HTML form. So we would have to use a different tool in order to send a put. And we'll learn about that later on. I just wanted to demonstrate that the code is being, well, the node process is being restarted in order to include all the new code that we wrote. It also shows us when we get a request and kind of shows us what that request was, how long it took, and what the response code was, and what the actual path was for that get. Right. So here we've got ourselves a couple of additional routes that we added just for fun. And the purpose of this video, now that we have it so that our code gets refreshed automatically for us, the whole point of this video is to talk about this request object that we get automatically through Express. And we're going to talk about how this works. So with this request right here, where we're doing a products 1, 2, 3, and we're doing a get request on it, we're going to go ahead and we are going to put a debug point in our code here. And then when it executes, what we're going to hope happens is that we'll be able to see what makes this request the request. So let's go ahead and restart or resend a request. And unfortunately, we're not getting anything here. We're not able to see this request. And that is because right now we are not running in debug mode in our application. So we're going to need to make some modifications in order to run all of our code in debug mode. And so that's going to be something we're going to do right here with start debug or start without debugging. So instead of running our application right here inside of our terminal, so we're going to do Control-C to stop that process, what we're going to do is we are going to run our application using debug. So start debugging right there. And when we do start debugging, it's going to go ahead and call a node process to be run, and it's going to run our executable file, which is this bin.ww. And then we're going to receive some debug options up here where we can stop the debugger, we can restart the debugging, and then we can pause and step through the code step by step. And that happens when we place a debug point in our code. And if this is your first time being introduced to debugging, you may want to pause the video, go learn about how to debug using Visual Studio Code. Reality is that through debugging, we have a wrapper that goes around our node process, just like Nodemon did. And what it's going to do is it's going to have a hold on the process as it executes, and as it steps through the code, if we have any breakpoints set, it's going to stop executing right at that point, and it's going to pause. So it's not really stopping the process, it's going to pause it, and then we'll have access to everything that is inside of our JavaScript world right there, and we'll be able to inspect it and see what's happening. So now that we've got it running under a debugger, and we've got a breakpoint at this 11 right here, and we are making a GET request to this path in our browser, I'm going to go ahead and refresh this, and you can see now that this line is highlighted. We've got the breakpoint right here is now highlighted that we have paused execution at this point. Now because we've done that, we now have the ability to hover over the different variables that are inside of our execution at this point in time, and we can inspect them. In other words, we can look to see what makes them what they are. And here we're going to go ahead and we are going to inspect this request object so we can see what makes it what it is. Now if you remember back to our HTTP video where we learned about the request and response, and through the browser we were able to inspect the request that was being sent out by the browser. Same thing happens here. When the request comes into Express, Express then dissects that HTTP request because it understands it, it's the interpreter, and then it converts it into JavaScript or JavaScript objects that then hold all the information about the request that we need to know about inside of our application. And here, when I hover over the REQ, which stands for the request, it then shows us this object dissected into all of its properties and functions that it has available to it. And we're going to focus on a couple of them. Right here, the base URL, you can see the /products. The /products, or the base URL, that corresponds to the base URL right here that this router is handling. And so let's go back into that object. And let's go back to our base URL. Now the body represents the data that is being sent in the request to the web server. Now, since it's a GET, we really don't have anything inside of the body. Now, down here, as we look closer, we can also look at any cookies that were sent to us by the browser. And here we can look at the headers. Now, when we looked over the HTTP headers in the browser, you can see that those were pretty much just translated over to this object. And now we have access to all the HTTP headers that came across in that request. We can see what is being accepted by the browser on the other side, the fact that it allows some zipping or compression of the files, that it's US English. All of these we saw, or the majority of these we saw when we looked at it, when we looked at the request in the browser. So this is the request object. It has a lot of useful information. It tells us what version of HTTP we're using. It tells us what HTTP method was used when the request was made, and that's why this particular method is responding to the request, is because we identified that this router was going to handle any request that was of type GET, that was a GET method, and that had this similar pattern in its URL. So if we go back to our request here, and we go back down here to our method, we see GET right here. And then we see the full URL, that original URL. And then we also see the path. And of course, if we go back to our router, we see that we've got the products path, or this is the full path. And then inside of our app, we were handling this, or we assigned this base path to this router. And then this particular function is handling anything after products that fits this particular pattern. So if we jump back into our request, we come back down here, we'll see the path is /123. And because, of course, this particular function in our router handles a / and then any ID, so / plus any value like this 123, we know that this router is actually going, or this router function is going to handle this particular request. We can see that the protocol is HTTP. And then we can get down here and see all kinds of stuff. Here we have the route. Now this route object defines the routing that is happening within our router. And so the method we have is get, the path is /ID, and our router knows that it's going to handle this, as well as some other information in here. We've also got the URL that happens, whether or not it's an XHR request, in other words, is it an asynchronous JavaScript request, or is it a regular HTTP request? So we've got a lot of useful information inside of this request object that allows us to kind of dive in if we need to check for anything inside the request. And in this case, of course, we don't really need to check anything in the request. We just know that we have a request that came in that meets all of these parameters for the router. And then we are going to send back some information. So in the next video, we're going to dissect this request object and see how it works.